Today at the National Press Club, the Australian Labor Party's National Secretary Paul Erickson. As Labor's campaign director in 2022, he helped lead the party to victory from opposition, this year going on to deliver one of its biggest wins. Here's Paul Erickson with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address. My name's Tom Connell. I'm the president here at the club and also the chief election analyst at Sky News. Today is our guest is Labor Party National Secretary Paul Erickson. As a matter of note, as we always do, we extended the same invitation as well to the Liberal Party for a post-election address. 4 months ago, the writing was seemingly on the wall. Voters had had a summer to mull over the political offerings, the news poll at the coalition taking the two-party preferred lead, and also the expectation of an April election, so we weren't far away, and Labor's primary vote was set to go to a new record low after 2022. Presumably, I don't know this for a fact, presumably Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was telling his Copacabana renters to order some cardboard boxes as well. Now, Labor is set to win the equal most seats ever in the lower house. In fact, Anthony Albanese assured me Caldwell's over the line, so it will be number 94. That will be the first time a government has not lost a seat at all, a single seat, since 1966. The leaders of the Greens and Liberal Party have lost their seats as well. The coalition have started a trial separation. To tell us how this all happened and perhaps why the Fourth Estate commentary wasn't quite as prescient as we like to think, please welcome Paul Erickson.
Thanks very much, Tom, for that introduction. And I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we gather on here today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders. And I extend that respect to all First Nations people here today. Thank you to the National Press Club, to Morris and the board, to the members and the sponsors, for the invitation to join you today to discuss the 2025 federal election. And I acknowledge that we have the Prime Minister here, and thank you to the Prime Minister for coming, and a number of colleagues from the Ministry and the caucus in the Federal Parliament, as well as the Victorian Parliament, and the members of the Diplomatic Corps that are here as well, I acknowledge. 3 years ago today, the Australian people voted for a change of direction and elected a Labor government led by Anthony Albanese. Labor won the 2022 election because the Prime Minister talked about the future and offered the country an alternative to more of the same. On the 3rd day of May 2025, Australians confronted a starker choice. Unlike the decision in 2022 between renewal and stasis, this year's election was, as the Prime Minister said here in January, a choice between two completely different visions for our nation, for our economy, for our people and our place in the world. Labor sought the opportunity to keep building Australia's future. Our policy offering focused on making households better off over the next 3 years, building on the foundations laid during the first term. Growing the economy, delivering lasting cost of living relief, strengthening Medicare, building more homes and increasing investment in renewables. Those policies gave expression to a positive vision of who we are and invited the electorate to choose a uniquely Australian way of dealing with global uncertainty. And that vision was underscored by Anthony Albanese's steady, authentic and measured leadership. In contrast, Peter Dutton promised to drag the country backwards, back to the cuts of the Coalition's decade in power with a promise to slash billions that would have put even the Abbott hockey budget in the shade. Back to the relentless, confected division of culture wars and punching down, and back to the evidence-free, politics-first approach to energy that held the country back the last time the Coalition were in power. Our campaign succeeded because Australians accepted two simple arguments that we put forward. First, Anthony Albanese was the only leader with a plan to make Australians better off over the next 3 years. And in uncertain times, Peter Dutton was not a risk worth taking. As Tom said, though, at the beginning of 2025, the conventional wisdom was that Labor faced an uphill battle to stay in power, let alone secure a majority. The coalition held a modest lead in the published polls, and Labor was being written off by many. This groupthink was informed by international events. During 2024, more people voted in national elections than any year in history, and incumbents were punished everywhere. But it was more than that. The opposition embraced this consensus, and they were more focused on claiming front-runner status than explaining what they would do if they won. This built on their misread of the 2023 referendum, convincing themselves that a century-old reluctance to change the Constitution represented a realignment of Australian politics and an endorsement of their narrow worldview. In fact, a defining condition of public opinion coming into 2025 was how open to hearing from both sides many voters were. It had been a very tough few years, and after 3 years of cost of living pressure, many voters were prepared to consider the alternative. But equally, there was an appreciation that Labor had seen the country through a very tough period and that it would take more than 3 years to clean up the messes that we inherited. In retrospect, it's easy to be critical of the coalition for assuming that the anti-incumbent wave would keep rolling into 2025 and they didn't need to do anything other than ride it. But the coalition were not alone. There was a conventional wisdom that undervalued Labor's capacity to use our record as the foundation for our second-term policy offer, and it underestimated the capacity of the Australian electorate to assess how their leaders were responding to changing circumstances here and across the globe. To understand why, 4 features of the 47th Parliament are worth recalling. First, for 3 years, one issue, the cost of living, was dominant to an extent that doesn't normally happen outside of wartime and pandemic. It is impossible for any government to completely satisfy the demand for cost of living relief during an inflation surge. And that's why we saw governments as ideologically diverse as the Biden-Harris administration, the UK Conservatives, the Japanese LDP, the Indian BJP and the Portuguese Socialists go backwards at national elections during 2024. But in the face of that cost of living challenge, Labor did everything that we could. Over 3 years, we delivered a comprehensive agenda of responsible cost of living relief that made a difference. Tax cuts for every taxpayer, energy bill relief, cheaper medicines, free TAFE, Medicare urgent care clinics, cheaper childcare, reduced HECS debts, and pay rises for millions of workers. These measures had another thing in common. Peter Dutton and the Coalition opposed every single one. So over the 3 years, Labor's record and Peter Dutton's opposition built an advantage for Labor as the best party to provide cost of living relief. Secondly, the government's economic strategy got inflation down without paying for it with a recession or higher unemployment. There is no more important achievement for a Labor government. Today, unemployment remains low and annual real wages have grown for 18 months straight. If the Coalition had their way, this wouldn't have been the case. They opposed our cost of living relief and wanted to slash and burn the budget with $350 billion of cuts when the economy was weak. They argued for higher interest rates and would have been happy with the carnage in the labour market that could have brought on. At every point, they wanted things to be harder for Australians because they thought it would make the politics easier for them. Instead, Labor's economy will deliver lower inflation, higher wages, continued employment growth and further tax cuts. Thirdly, under Labor, Australia has put an end to the denial and delay and is replacing renewable energy embracing renewable energy to power our economy. In the decade before 2022, Australia's policy settings barely acknowledged climate change and there was no plan for keeping the lights on. Now we are taking advantage of the opportunities created by the global shift to renewables. And as the Prime Minister said at our launch, Labor has one energy policy and we are delivering it. Driving private sector investment in renewables backed by gas, hydro and batteries. And this policy is working. Australia is producing record renewable energy. Our emissions are lower than when Labor was elected and we're on track to achieve our emissions reduction goals. In contrast, after a chaotic decade pushing 23 different energy policies without landing one, Peter Dutton, David Littleproud and Ted O'Brien spent the last 3 years plugging nuclear energy and then running away from the detail, as exemplified by Mr Dutton's failure to visit any of his proposed sites during the campaign. And fourthly, Labor used our first term to lay the foundations for the long-term reforms Australia needs. Bulk billing is on the way back and more than 1.2 million Australians have already been treated at a Medicare urgent care clinic. To address a housing crisis that has been decades in the making, Labor has started the largest housing build in Australia's history. And public TAFE has been restored to its rightful place at the centre of vocational education. In response to this agenda, the Coalition wanted to have it both ways, to claim they would have done a better job, but to hide the detail of their alternative plans. They opposed Labor's Medicare urgent care clinics, calling them wasteful spending. They joined with the Greens to block Labor's housing agenda and promised to cut funding for new homes. And they tried to block free TAFE and promised to axe it because, according to the new Liberal leader, if you don't pay for something, you don't value it. But when it came to the campaign, Peter Dutton said that Australians would have to wait until after the election to find out where a Dutton government would cut. Instead of campaigning on the details of his plan, he left a vacuum. So to sum up those 3 years, Labor's strategy was to provide cost of living relief, weather the storm of the global inflation surge, kickstart the shift to renewables and lay the groundwork for long-term reform. The Coalition's strategy under Peter Dutton had 3 prongs. First, maintain coalition unity at all costs, meaning internally the lowest common denominator always won out. As a result, the ideas that the Coalition put forward in the term and in the campaign were a pitiful crop cultivated in the poor and infertile patch of common ground that the Coalition could agree to stand on. Secondly, they opposed everything proposed by Labor. This approach arose from Dutton's judgment at the end of 2022 that he couldn't prosecute his case against the Prime Minister if the Parliament was successfully dealing with major challenges. And it had the added benefit for the Coalition of empowering the Greens. And then thirdly, to trade in their middle-class supporters in urban electorates for a path to victory built on frustration with inflation in the outer suburbs and the regions. And all 3 prongs of that strategy were wrapped up in the rhetoric of fear and myopia. Having recognised their strategy, we reached some conclusions, which I set out at the end of 2023 at the WA Labor Conference and at the ALP National Executive. Firstly, that the Coalition wouldn't even try to cast themselves as a positive alternative because they are only held together by their hostility to Labor. Second, the Coalition's blocking strategy meant that Labor had to grapple with the challenge of a Greens political party that was equally committed to frustrating progress. And third, in the contest between Labor initiative and Coalition reaction, we needed to draw the battle lines over cost of living. The Dutton strategy also tells us a lot about decision-making within the Liberal Party. They operate in an echo chamber. They are more concerned with the prejudices of their hardcore supporters than the experiences of working people. They've imbibed a mistaken analysis of how Tony Abbott won in 2013 that overlooks the role played by division within Labor in the demise of the last Labor government. And on the transition to renewables, they remain fatally committed to denial and delay. The relevant precedent for the Liberal Party's refusal to come to terms with reality on climate and energy is their attitude to Medicare during the Hawke and Keating governments. It took 5 election defeats before the Liberals conceded the obvious, that the Howard-Peacock policy of destroying Medicare and replacing it with cost-neutral arrangements that left no one worse off was nonsense. That doesn't mean they accepted the principle of universal health care. They still undermine Medicare whenever they get into power, but they no longer campaign on abolishing it and they've stopped pretending that they have an alternative plan. Whether it takes them another decade to adjust to reality on energy is a matter for them. This brings me to the 5 critical factors that delivered the result on the 3rd of May. First, building Australia's future. The campaign theme launched on 3 November 2014 in the South Australian electorate of Sturt exactly 6 months before election day. The Prime Minister at our rally in Adelaide outlined a campaign where both the progress delivered and the changes to come were at stake. We wouldn't shy away from arguing that with another term, Labor could get big things done and we had a plan that would make a real difference. In every electorate, in every portfolio, our campaign would point to first-term delivery and outline second-term ambition, and we would ensure that by May, the choice about which party would make you better off over the next 3 years was the central question in the election. This strategy worked because it was enlivened by the policy ideas that we campaigned on over 6 months. Lasting cost of living relief with further tax cuts and a $1,000 instant tax deduction for all workers, building on the 2024 tax cuts for every taxpayer. Cutting HECS debts by 20%, building on the $3 billion already wiped from student debt when Labor fixed indexation. Making free TAFE permanent to boost Australia's workforce, building on the free TAFE program launched in January 2023. And the 5% deposit plan and 100,000 new homes for first home buyers announced at the launch in Perth, building on our efforts to expand supply. The second factor was Medicare and our decision to put it at the heart of our campaign 3 months out from polling day. Labor's plans for Medicare were the pinnacle of our argument that with another 3 years we could build on those strong foundations. There was no debate about our promise to restore bulk billing so that 9 in 10 GP visits are bulk billed by 2030. But in past campaigns, a major party might have held back its centrepiece policy commitment until the final 5 weeks to maximise cut-through. Peter Dutton's campaign took this to absurd extremes. With less than 2 weeks to go, on Insiders with David, Michael Sukkar said the coalition was saving up their policies so that they could, quote, connect with Australians when they're going to switch on. I remember watching that interview and thinking, you haven't got long now, brother. Like, the third factor was the economy and Labor's ascendancy in the economic debate that was front and centre in the campaign. I observed earlier that Labor's economic strategy got inflation down without paying for it with a recession and higher unemployment. In the campaign, we were able to point to that record and highlight the contrast with a decade of coalition failure. When Labor came to power, inflation was going up and real wages were going down. By election day, inflation was 2.4% and real wages had grown 5 quarters in a row. February's rate cut crystallised confidence that the economy had turned the corner, and yesterday's rate cut confirmed the progress that Australia is continuing to make. And further permanent cost of living relief announced in the campaign, in the budget and in the campaign, was at the core of our plan for the next 3 years. The fourth factor in our win was the Prime Minister's performance. From the first Monday of January through to election day, the Prime Minister was in the form of a lifetime. Originally, I wrote here that the PM didn't put a foot wrong, but this would have summoned the Coalition's media cheer squad to interview the stage from the Mining and Energy Union conference up in Newcastle as part of a feature on Labor lies. So instead, I will argue that at a presentational level, the Prime Minister's campaigning was exemplary. The rallies, the speeches and the launch, the street walks, the school visits and the shifts on pre-poll. The debates, which every sensible observer scored as 4-0. Albo was in his element, connecting with everyday people and enjoying it. And while the Prime Minister was telling a positive story about who we are and where we're going, Peter Dutton was gloomy about the country, downcast about the future, and most animated when he was magnifying the problems facing Australia, which connects to the more substantive dimension to the leadership contrast. The Prime Minister and the opposition leader were confronted by some critical leadership tests. The imposition of tariffs on Australian aluminium and steel, Tropical Cyclone Alfred, Liberation Day, the disruption of Anzac Day commemorations by a neo-Nazi. The contrast was as clear as night and day. The Prime Minister offered authentic, measured and firm leadership, and Peter Dutton never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. My view that Peter Dutton was the fifth major factor in Labor's win won't surprise anyone today. We identified early that Mr Dutton represented an unacceptable risk on 2 levels. First, the material risk. When Mr Dutton was Tony Abbott's Health Minister, he cut $50 billion from hospitals, he tried to end bulk billing, he wanted to charge for emergency room visits, and he made medicines more expensive. As opposition leader, he opposed Labor's tax cuts, he opposed our Medicare urgent care clinics, he opposed cheaper medicines and cheaper childcare, and he opposed energy bill relief. During the term, he said he would have cut at least $350 billion from the services that Australians rely on, and the money for his $600 billion nuclear scheme had to come from somewhere. This gave us a lot to work with, but even before our campaign amplified these facts, our research identified some deeper reservations about Peter Dutton. 1 year ago, our target voters already believed that they would be worse off under a Dutton government because of the risk posed by Peter Dutton's character. His recklessness concerned them and made them worry about what kind of Prime Minister he would be. His aggression and intolerance unsettled people. And above all, his hard-headedness, his lack of empathy, his lack of understanding of ordinary people's lives kept coming to the fore. Mr Dutton's inability to make up his mind about who his campaign was aimed at made these risks ever more present. Was he focused on Australians who were looking for the party with the best plan to make them better off over the next 3 years? Or was his priority winning over voters who were looking for an Australian version of MAGA? Elections are about choices, and the choices leaders make send a message about their priorities. Whilst the Prime Minister was focused on the economy, cost of living and Medicare, Mr Dutton appointed Senator Price as Shadow Minister for Government Efficiency, promised he would roll back working from home, shattered confidence in his competence with the poorly executed back down on his working from home policy, promised to cut 41,000 public servants, suggested the Federal Department of Education could be abolished, doubled down with the suggestion Australia could live without the Federal Department of Health, which delivers Medicare, by the way, and applauded Senator Price when she promised that a vote for the Liberal Party would make Australia great again. Each of these features of the Liberal Party campaign were of their own initiative, not ours. By the closing week of the campaign, our tracking poll found that voters believed that Labor's campaign was more focused on the issues that mattered to them personally than the coalition, by a margin of 16 points. Labor was the best party to make them personally better off over the next 3 years, by a margin of 12 points. The coalition had told the most lies during the campaign, by a margin of 5 points. The coalition made more promises they couldn't afford, by a margin of 9, and the coalition ran the more negative campaign, by a margin of 11 points. These results are the ultimate indictment of the coalition's closing focus on culture wars instead of cost of living. They also, and we acknowledge this, represented a significant turnaround compared to expectations at the beginning of the year. But this turnaround was not an accident, nor did it arise from luck or the impact of external events. The coalition's lead in the summer was an expression of many things, but it was not born of a comparison between the Labor government and the coalition opposition. Instead of horse race polling, our research program was dedicated to building out our campaign by identifying strengths and weaknesses. Whilst Peter Dutton was seen by some voters as doing his job as opposition leader well during the term by opposing the government at every turn, these same voters had reservations about what kind of Prime Minister he would make. The coalition believed that they could win the election by asking people whether they were better off today than they were 3 years ago. But looking back reminded voters of the Morrison government and Peter Dutton's track record, which was very weak territory for them. In November 2024, Peter Dutton's performance in the last coalition government in our polling was rated as poor by 37% of voters. Only 27% rated it as good. And the performance of the Morrison government was rated as poor by 41% of voters. Only 25% rated it as good. Most voters, particularly young people who had felt the pressure of inflation more than most, were more concerned about who would make them better off over the next 3 years. And this was much stronger ground for Labor. Our research program was dedicated to unlocking that potential. Finally, we did our best to ignore the running commentary about the inevitability of the hung parliament because of this published poll or that state factor or this industry commission poll or that bit of coalition backgrounding. Labor refused to be distracted by a media narrative that talked up the prospects of a Dutton victory, dismissed the possibility of a Labor majority government and obsessed about minority government. And instead, from the leadership through to the caucus, across the organisation and the whole of the party, we stayed on strategy. In partnership with our state branches, our candidates and our creative agencies, we built the strongest possible local campaigns where we knew we needed them. And as a result, we are confident that when counting concludes, this will be the first election since 1966 where the incumbent party didn't lose a seat. Labor is indebted to our research operation and to the people who worked on it. At Pixis Polling and Insights, Campbell White and his team. At Talbot Mills, David Talbot, Rosa Teal and Lachlan Poulter and their team. At Essential Research, Peter Lewis, Alyssa Henderson and their team. And in the Secretariat, our Research and Data Manager, Matilda Stevenson. The research program was only as good as its principal output, the most sophisticated advertising campaign Labor's ever executed. At the beginning of the year, there was cautious optimism in the community that the economy was turning the corner and that 2025 would be better than the last few years. However, global news was driving uncertainty and holding back any broader shift in the national mood. Finally, cost of living was still the dominant factor. It wasn't in the rearview mirror yet. Our two opening ads, Labor's cost of living measures and Building Australia's Future, spoke to that sentiment. They reminded voters of the relief Labor had delivered and they outlined Anthony Albanese's plan to make Australians better off. They kicked off a campaign that our lead creative, Dee Madigan, and her colleagues at Campaign Edge, led by Stuart Gillies, deserve unconditional praise for. Dee's creativity brought clarity, emotion and narrative edge to each of her ads, not least the He Cuts, You Pay campaign. Likewise, Darren Moss, Donna McInerney and the Moss Group took on some of the toughest assignments going in this campaign, and Darren delivered some of the most lethal ads of the campaign. A huge effort was led by our Assistant National Secretary Jen Light and Joanna Kerrin in the Secretariat to produce tailored local ads for dozens of electorates in collaboration with our state branches and local campaigns. And I want to thank Charlie Tanos and Diverse Communications for helping us engage strategically with communities across the country. Lastly, with respect to advertising, none of this would have been possible without Louise McGee's leadership of the advertising and research team. In an operation with a little bit of an inbuilt risk of overcomplication, Louise skillfully ensured discipline and clarity, and the collaboration with our media strategists, Mindshare and Sparrow, to execute the advertising placement was a high point. One of the sorer points after the 2022 election for Labor was the recognition that we had underestimated the threat from the Greens, particularly in South East Queensland. And our 2022 campaign review, led by Greg Combay and Linda Ashalom, called on the party to more directly contest the political positions advocated by the Greens and dedicate resources to this task. The subsequent behaviour of the Greens made this recommendation more prescient than any of us realised at the end of 2022. The Coalition's blocking strategy meant we had to grapple with the challenge of a Greens political party that was equally committed to frustrating progress. Whether that was because of ideological fervour or their weird internals is beyond me. But their actions meant that perceptions of the Greens were defined by blocking tactics and aggressive attacks on Labor. Until late in the piece, they seemed confident of a dividend from this behaviour. In August of last year, Adam Bandt came here and declared to the National Press Club that the Greens were a strong chance to gain at least 5 more seats. And their briefings nominated Moreton, Richmond, Wills, McNamara, Perth and Sturt, which is 6. 2 years ago, we resourced a dedicated effort in the Secretariat to confront this challenge and worked with our candidates and members in 3-cornered contests across the country. Ben Coates in the Secretariat and the team at the Shannon Company, led by Michael Daddo, Alyssa Horan and Teal Stone, took on this unenviable task. Rather than evaluate their work, I'll quote Adam Bandt. I spent a fair bit of time on polling booths in Melbourne and had quite a few conversations where people told me that they usually vote Green, but this time they didn't because of Peter Dutton. And on this, I just want to say hats off to the Prime Minister and to the Labor campaign machine on this point for making it such a central feature of the campaign. I think we have to acknowledge they did run a very good campaign. So, thanks, Adam. Before moving to questions, I just want to recognise a few other contributions. I mentioned Jen Light earlier. Jen never seeks the limelight. She just gets on with the job. But we wouldn't have won a majority in 2022 without the brilliant work of Jen and the Target Seats unit that she leads. In 2025, they delivered again. I also want to thank the State and Territory Secretaries of the ALP and all of the officials and organisers who worked on the campaign, the ALP National Executive, particularly our National President, Wayne Swan, the Prime Minister's Office and the team on the plane, especially Tim Gartrell, David Epstein, Fiona Sugden, Catherine Murphy, Sam Trobe, Jeff Singleton, James Newton and Anna Long. Everyone who worked in campaign headquarters, especially our Operations Director Monique Earsman and ICT Director Rory Killen, who delivered the only CHQ I've ever seen that people didn't want to leave. The unit directors at CHQ, led by Georgia Goldsworthy and Ben Rillo, Adam Gartrell, Andrew Dempster, Cameron Petrie, Chloe Bennett, Hannah Frank, Houston Ash, Jenny Mason and Tom Mooney. Our digital director, Kate Ryan, who couldn't be here today. This campaign was the culmination of more than 4 years of work by Kate transforming our digital communication and organising. Our events and fundraising team, led by Lucinda Needham, our finance director, Heather Watkins, and our executive officer, Bernie Shaw. And the Labor Party's membership and the mighty trade union movement. Every campaign is a collective effort, and I want to thank every single Labor supporter and union member who knocked on a door, handed out a how to vote card, or donated to support the cause of Labor. Lastly, on a personal note, I want to thank Dimity for our partnership over the last 3 years and her patience over the last 10 months. I'm told that I'll be in your debt for about 30 years. And we wouldn't have been able to manage without the support from our friends and family, particularly Fran and Sue and Belinda. In summing up, since 2022, Melbourne University has been collating a 4-volume survey of Robert Menzies' life and career, edited by Zachary Gorman. In his introduction to the second volume, Gorman remarks on Menzies' good fortune in not being exposed to an echo chamber on the right of politics. The absence of a populist noise machine in the post-war period insulated Menzies from overreaches to rival Chifley's bank nationalisation, with the notable exception, of course, of the referendum to ban the Communist Party. There's something instructive there for both major parties. Labor won big in 1943 and 1946, enabling Curtin to lead Australia through the war and Chifley to create the post-war settlement. But overreach in 1949 let the Liberal Party back in. For the Liberal Party, I say elections are won when you learn the lessons from your defeats and escape the echo chambers on your own side. Whether they can do that is a question for them, but they should start by abandoning a nuclear energy scheme that takes too long, will cost too much, will do nothing to meet our energy needs, and was designed to kill off the transition to renewables. In choosing Labor on the 3rd of May, Australians chose progress over retreat and a uniquely Australian way of dealing with global uncertainty. They backed Anthony Albanese's plan to deliver for every community, growing the economy, delivering lasting cost of living relief, strengthening Medicare, building more homes and increasing investment in renewables. Australians rejected cuts and division and embraced a government committed to building Australia's future. Thank you again for the invitation to speak, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. You mentioned media commentary. I'm just wondering how many dozen times I said likely minority government, but happy to wear that. We should have a thick skin in our environment. But a lot of commentary, not just from media, from business types, from union types as well, talks about or bemoans a lack of big, hard-to-do reform in Australia in recent years. Given now one of those difficulties is gone in that Labor has a thumping majority and 2 paths in the Senate, the left and the right, if you like, particularly with the Liberal Party now no longer or temporarily not with the Nats. Is it time, or can Labor afford to get more ambitious in tough-to-do reform?
Thanks, Tom. Well, I think that there was a lot of ambition in the plan for the next 3 years that the Prime Minister and the Labor team put forward in the campaign. There's no shortage of ambition in our plan to make sure that 9 out of 10 visits to the GP are bulk billed by 2030. There's no shortage of ambition in what we're trying to do in energy, and there's no shortage of ambition in the changes that we're making to the economy to make sure that it delivers for working people. So I think that the best approach is for Labor to stay focused on the agenda that we campaigned on and that we sought a mandate for and that now we need to deliver. And I think that is what will drive the government's work and the legislative agenda in the parliament over the next 3 years.
All right, long list, short answer, but we'll go straight to the floor. Tessa Conomu from AAP.
Thank you very much for your time today. On Medicare, will Labor be able to run another campaign targeting the opposition on their track record if bulk billing rates haven't gone up?
Thanks, Tessa. We've got a very ambitious reform agenda in Medicare, but the coalition's attitude to Medicare is what will dictate whether we need to continue making the case that they represent such a threat. And in this campaign, that case was pretty straightforward. Before the 2013 election, Peter Dutton looked Australians in the eye and promised that there'd be no cuts to health. And then, when they were elected, he cut $50 billion from public hospitals and tried to end bulk billing and said that there were too many free Medicare services. So that record speaks for itself. Throughout the last parliament, they said that Medicare urgent care clinics were wasteful and the additional investments that we made in Medicare were, of course, part of the $350 billion in spending that they identified as unnecessary and wasteful and said should be cut. So their records on Medicare speaks for itself, and if they continue to oppose our efforts to deliver and grow universal healthcare, then we'll continue to call that out and point to the risk that they represent.
Next question, Anthony Galloway from Capital Brief.
Thank you. Congratulations on the result, and more importantly, congrats to you and Dimity on the new arrival during the campaign. I was wondering if I could ask about the Liberal Party's outer suburban strategy. You know, all campaign they were telling us, ignore the national polls, there's big swings on in those outer suburban seats, particularly in Victoria. Do you think that, and obviously that turned out to be rubbish once we saw the result of the election, do you think that caused them, caused a failure to see the swings that were happening against the Liberal Party much closer to the city in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane? And given that you mentioned that last year incumbents all over the world were getting beaten, is there a world in which in 2024 voters in those outer suburban electorates were turning a bit feral against Labor? Like, did that strategy ever make sense in your view from the Liberal Party, or was it ill-fated from the beginning?
Thanks, Anthony. Look, I like to think about things in these terms. The starting point should be where voters are, what matters to them, what issues are they focused on. And across the board, whether it was in the outer suburbs or the inner city or regional areas, the feedback we were getting was that cost of living was the #1 issue. And so our strategy was to have the best answer on who could make you better off over the next 3 years and drive the campaign towards that question. And because of the breadth of concern about cost of living, that was the right strategy for every geography or every sort of category of demographic that you care to name. In the campaign, a couple of observations about the points you've made about research. You know, I don't know anything of what was happening in their program, so that's a question for them. But during the campaign, what our research was telling us consistently and from the very beginning was that there was a swing to us on the primary vote, a swing to us on the two-party preferred. We established like a very, very strong lead by the end of the first week of the campaign in our tracking poll, and then held onto it all the way through. There were some variations in that. Things obviously at the beginning of the year looked tougher for us in Victoria, particularly after the Werribee by-election. But there are other states that looked very, very promising for us. And I like to think back to the 2019 election, where I think one of the mistakes we made was to spend too much time predicting different outcomes and then ultimately becoming hostage to the predictions that we've made, and not enough time just focused on running a campaign. And I do think that that is an error that they appear to have made in this campaign by front-running so much briefing out about what was happening in different parts of the country, where our focus was more on just talking to the voters in those places.
So obviously every campaign has a very local element, but is it a mistake to have a national campaign too focused on a type of seat, like outer suburbs?
Well, I made the observation when I was here 3 years ago that there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. And so you need to run a campaign that has a consistent strategy and theme and message that everything gets back to, but meets people where they are in every community around the country. And so that's the way that we thought about it, and the way that we structured the campaign. And we just tried to back in our candidates and campaign teams who, you know, are always going to know their community better than we do back at campaign headquarters, to give them what they needed to run the strongest possible campaigns on the ground.
Mark Riley from the 7 Network.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks for your address. I guess from a Labor perspective, it might seem today that not content with losing the election, the coalition is now losing its mind. But I wonder what your advice would be. It'd be easy to get carried away with what's happening, the fractured nature of what's happening on the other side of the parliament. What your advice is to the government as it now faces that landscape, changed landscape. I noticed that you have given some advice to the coalition to dump its nuclear policy. What other advice might you have for them?
Thanks, Mark. Well, I don't have advice to add to my prepared remarks for the Liberal Party or the National Party. The way that they organise themselves is a matter for them. For the government, you know, we need to stay very grounded and just stay focused on delivering the agenda that we were elected on. And I think that is where the focus has been over the first few weeks, and that's where it needs to remain. There will be all sorts of you know, drama and events happening sort of in other parties and around the parliament, but we need to stay focused on the voters who elected us and on delivering the agenda that we ran on, and I'm quite confident that that's where the party's focus will be.
Anna Henderson from SPS.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Paul. In terms of the defeat of the Voice referendum, which you mentioned in your prepared remarks, what lessons did you take away from the way the Coalition and the No vote communicated in that campaign that you applied in the election?
Thanks, Anna. The referendum, of course, was organised around yes and no. The Labor Party very strongly supported and advocated the case for yes, and we were an active participant in the campaign, but the campaigns were led by the organisations that were set up that organised themselves around the referendum. We paid close attention to what had happened online during the referendum and did quite a bit of work following it to understand how the No camp had organised their digital campaigning, you know, brought in some people to help us understand whether there were any lessons about how you organise yourself when you campaign online. That put together a bit of a roadmap for us about the work that we did out of campaign headquarters to make sure that we ran the strongest possible digital campaign in 2025. But the starting point really for us was what we did in 2022 rather than anything that arose out of the referendum. It was really about evaluating what had worked and what the lessons were for us rather than starting from scratch.
Were the influencers not maybe a secret weapon but a underrated weapon in regards to that approach?
Well, we thought about, you know, the media landscape has changed. That's clear, and it's continuing to evolve, and the pace of change is accelerating, so it's not static. So when we thought about our engagement through the media, there's traditional legacy media institutions, there's new and emerging forms of media, then there's individuals who are out there on different platforms you know, as content creators, and you know, we took the view that we needed to engage with all comers. So the Prime Minister came here in January and made our case for re-election, came back here during the campaign and answered everyone's questions during the final week. He was available to the travelling press pack every day, sometimes multiple times a day. But as you know, as your question notes, we also tried to connect with lots of new and emerging forms of media, new content creators, podcasters, things like that, and made the effort to be everywhere, because in that fragmented media environment, you can't pass up any opportunity to try to connect with people and get your message across.
Phil Curry from the AFR.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, Paul. Look, I'm just interested in your thoughts on how things have changed. Like 10 or so years ago, a 34 and a bit primary vote would have been considered a failure by Labor. It's now handed you nearly 2/3 of the parliament, and preferences obviously now much more important than they once were. Can you sort of comment on that sort of new reality, and are these massive margins, like you've won this election, more volatile than perhaps they would have once been when you had a primary vote with a 4 in front of it?
Sure. Thanks, Phil. A few observations on that. First, the government's formed in the House of Representatives by the party that's in a position to command a majority. So you go into the campaign with the objective of winning a majority in the House, and you organise yourself accordingly. The primary vote matters for that, but what's more important is the relative strength of your primary vote compared to our principal opponent, the other major parties. So as you say, we've got a primary vote of 34.6 is where it looks like it is on the counting at the moment. But in the campaign, you're not so much focused on trying to drive up that number as you are trying to run the strongest possible campaigns in all the places that you need to be in to get to a majority. So that's how we thought about the campaign. A couple of other observations about the primary vote. This is the first election since 1946 where our Senate primary vote's actually stronger than our vote in the House of Representatives. And we think the reason for that is there's about 14 electorates around the country where the Senate primary vote is more than 10 points higher than in the House. And it's largely, we think, because of Labor supporters and people of a progressive mindset who are voting tactically in different electorates where there are challenges from other parties or independents who make the argument locally that they're the candidate best placed to support the candidate best placed locally to defeat the coalition.
Bradford.
That 34.6 primary in the House, I don't think that it actually is an accurate reflection of the proportion of the Australian population that would have cast a vote for Labor if they had to in their own electorate, if that was what they needed to do to elect a Labor government. So that's a factor. And the other point that stands out, just to repeat something that I said earlier, is in that world of a declining primary vote for both of the major parties, it means that there's no such thing as a safe seat. And so you have to make sure that you're running the strongest possible candidates and campaigns everywhere in the country that you think you've got a prospect of winning.
Thanks, mate.
Next question, David Spears from the ABC.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Paul, for your address, and congratulations on the campaign success. As you noted, the number one issue for voters was cost of living. That's what you were picking up. It was very clear. The morning after the election, when Treasurer Jim Chalmers said the priority would shift from tackling inflation in the first term to tackling productivity now in the second term, did you also pick up, or are you picking up now, an appetite in the electorate for doing more on productivity and fixing the budget to prevent younger generations having to carry the load? And as a campaign guru, what steps should Labor follow if it is going to pursue some difficult reforms on the economy and fixing the budget? I mean, you've said a few times this afternoon, stay focused on delivering the agenda we were elected on. Are you saying don't go beyond that? And if Labor is going to go beyond that, how should they bring the people with them?
Thanks very much, David. Look, I think the way that voters would describe what they're looking for from political leaders is they're looking for a plan. They're looking for a plan to make them better off, and they're looking for a plan that takes the country in the direction that we need to go in. I hate to break it to you, but I haven't seen too many detailed discussions of productivity in a focus group. But that does not take away from the importance of the task, and the Treasurer is very correct to identify that just as in the first term, the focus was on getting that soft landing, bringing down inflation without giving up on any of the gains that we've made in the labour market. In the second term, the focus shifts to driving productivity. On your broader questions about reform, you have to bring people with you. You have to make the case for why it's important, for what the benefits will be, and that's something I think that has been a hallmark of the government over the 3 years, and I'm confident of our ability to continue meeting the challenges that are thrown at the country.
Next question comes from Sarah Ison from The Australian.
Thank you, Paul, for your address, and congrats for everything, particularly somehow becoming a first-time dad. Still a bit surprised at how you managed to do that during a campaign. Wild. I just wanted to... It was crazy. I wanted to ask you about the Teal Independence. I wanted to ask you about Teal Independence. Being a proud West Australian, I was acutely aware of how close it got for Josh Wilson in Fremantle. I think similarly it was very nail-biting for David Smith in Bean. So next time, do you think that threat to Labor from the Teals would be even greater? Could we see a Teal unseat a Labor MP? That hasn't happened before. Is that a real possibility at the next election?
Thanks very much, Sarah. Well, the two examples you cite in Western Australia and the ACT, there was a West Australian election in March and there was an ACT election last October. And in both of those elections, we saw independents record very strong votes, particularly in some of the parts of the WA and the ACT where there were then strong challenges from independents in the federal election. So we were not surprised to see those independent challenges emerge. And if there are lessons out of those campaigns that we need to study and examine and take on board and apply to the next election, then that's something that we'll do through our campaign review process.
But it was very specific to those circumstances, is your view, given there were two elections. They're very specific circumstances, not maybe a broader trend at this point.
Oh, look, I think the point I was making was that in Fremantle and Bean, there had been similar challenges in recent state and territory elections, and so it's perhaps not that they are so specific to be sort of set aside as something that's local, but they're part of a broader trend that you've identified in your question, and we'll be having a good look at what that means for how we campaign. To me, it reinforces the point that there's no such thing as a safe seat.
For sure. Thank you.
James Massola from the SMH and The Age.
Paul, thanks for your address, and yeah, I'd also like to say congratulations to you and Dimity on the birth of your first child. Look, by the time the 2028 election rolls around, we will have had 3 years of essentially a completely different political landscape. We'll have Susan Lee, probably still the leader of the Liberal Party, the Nationals probably still broken up with the Liberals, and 3 years of a much diminished Greens Party. So what I'd like to ask is, will you be there in 2028 to lead the campaign? How should Labor respond? I mean, Anthony Albanese behind us here will be the first PM to oppose or contest an election with a female Liberal leader. And thirdly, are the Greens in danger of going the way of the Democrats?
I think you broke the rule. That's 3 questions.
Yeah. I'm not the first. I'm not the first.
Okay. So on the first question, I've got a decision to make, and we've got a decision to make that I'll make with my family over the course of probably the balance of this year, about whether I put my name forward at the next national conference for another term as the National Secretary. Lindsay Tanner gave me some really good advice when I became the Assistant National Secretary back in 2014, which is that there's 2 types of party officials. There are those that view time at head office as a stepping stone to something else. And then there are those like Bob Hogg, who Lindsay identified as sort of a pretty exemplary example of this, who are just there to do what's best for the party and make it a vocation and spend time, like significant time, working for the party. And if you look back on that, on Bob's career, whether it's the work that he did in Victorian Labor in the 1970s or work here in Canberra in the 1980s and the 1990s, Bob probably had more of an impact than many members of the Cabinet over the course of 83 to 96. So the question for me is a pretty simple one about whether we go around again, and I'll make my mind up between now and the end of the year, most likely. On your broader questions about the next contest, you know, a week's a long time in politics. I don't think that any of us here should be casting forward about what things might look like in 3 years. The focus for us just has to be on delivering on the agenda that we were elected on and being a good government. And that will be what people will be measuring us by, not like whether we're able to pick what the trends will look like in a few years' time.
Thank you.
So as to the first question, it sounds like you're not keeping your eye on potential by-elections or anything like that?
No.
No? Okay. Next question, Claire Armstrong from the Daily Telegraph.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for your time, Paul. During the campaign, Labor's explanation for making claims that the coalition described as basically a scare campaign was that it was reasonable to infer from Peter Dutton's performance as Health Minister a decade ago that he would do the same if given the chance as Prime Minister. So if we had truth and political advertising laws in this country, do you believe that ads like Peter Dutton is going to cut existing urgent care clinics to pay for nuclear would pass, given the coalition had explicitly committed to that example?
Thanks very much, Claire. Well, 2 points on that. First, Peter Dutton also said back on the 20th of March at the Lowy Institute that past performance is the best indicator of future practice. And I won't again catalogue what past performance and rhetoric from Peter Dutton entails, but he went to the election refusing to say what they would cut, and on form we're like completely comfortable with the assertions that we made that the risk that he posed to Medicare and to Australians' access to healthcare was too great a risk to accept and was a very relevant question in the campaign. On truth in political advertising, it's been in our platform since 2021 that Australia needs a truth in political advertising framework. We have truth in political advertising frameworks in South Australia and the ACTs. There's a couple of models for how they've worked, but there's a set of really important questions that need to be worked through about who the umpire is, how the process works, what the penalties and the sanctions are, because you've got to get the balance right, and you don't want to end up having a dampening effect and actually having some perverse consequences where you start stifling free speech or participation in politics and campaigns, both for first principles reasons and because the High Court's found that there is the implied right of the freedom of political communication in the Constitution. So there's some very big questions to work through there, and I'm sure that the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters will take that up as part of their inquiry into the election. But I'm sure that all of the ads that we ran in this campaign would have sailed through a truth in political advertising framework because we were really, really very comfortable with the argument that we were putting forward.
Next question from Tom McElroy from The Guardian.
Paul, thanks for taking our questions. You said that you believe the Liberals' nuclear policy is designed to slow the transition to renewables or knock it off course completely. The science of climate is settled, but is the politics? Do you think that there's still juice for the right of politics in Australia to extract from the issue of climate, or would you expect that voters have settled their views and will vote accordingly in the future?
Thanks, Tom. Well, I think I made a case in my remarks that the coalition needs to accept the lessons from the last two federal elections and their last two defeats if they want to be competitive again. And I think that starts with facing up to the reality of climate change and to the energy transition that the country needs to make and to the opportunities that that represents. And so that's a question for them. But I think if they continue on the path that they're on of delay and denial, then they'll continue getting the sorts of outcomes that we saw on the 3rd of May.
Thanks.
Amanda Cott from the Nine Network.
G'day, Paul. How you going? You've offered a bit of advice to the coalition throughout your speech and in answer to our questions. One of those pieces of advice was to learn from past losses. What lessons will you be taking from Labor's past losses to make sure that you win the next and the next campaign?
Sure. Thanks, Amanda. Well, we're I think, unique in parties of government around the world in our practice of conducting very thoroughgoing reviews after every election and making those reviews public and being accountable to our supporters and our members for our implementation of those review findings. Dr. Craig Emerson's here. Craig, along with Jay Weatherall, led our 2019 campaign review, and I mentioned earlier what a valuable roadmap the 2022 campaign review, led by Greg Combay and Linda O'Sharlin, but which Craig was also involved in. What a valuable roadmap that's been for us over the last 3 years. So we'll take the time to carefully examine the results and look at what happened in the campaign. And probably be a little bit easier review to conduct than the work that we gave Craig and Jay to do in 2019, but nonetheless we'll take it seriously.
Is it important to sort of be, I guess, as honest as you can and go, well, the work from home stuff really helped, that sort of momentum? You said it before, you felt like you were well ahead in week 1 of the campaign.
Yeah, I think that you've got to be honest with yourself about what worked and what didn't, and not engage in myth-making that then leads to people making the wrong calls later on based on a misread or a misunderstanding of what happened, which is what I think happened in the Coalition in terms of their interpretation of the 2023 referendum.
Jason Koutsoukis from the Saturday paper.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you, Paul, for the speech. The right-wing campaign group, Advance, spent a lot of money last year attacking the Greens, even more money this year, and during the campaign attacking Labor and the government. Do you see any evidence that any of that messaging was effective? And do you think Advance has a big role to play in future campaigns?
Sure. Well, I'll be careful what I say about Advance, because if I'm too critical of them, they'll just use that as fundraising bait. But I do think that they're part of the echo chamber that I talked about that amplified the Coalition's focus on culture wars, which I don't think was productive for the Coalition in the campaign. So.
And they're claiming a lot of credit for knocking off those 3 lower house Greens members. Do you think that's...
I don't think they played a big role in those contests in Brisbane and Griffith and Melbourne. The feedback that we were getting was that voters were concerned about the Greens' blocking tactics and their relentless attacks on Labor. If you look at the content that Advance were putting out about the Greens, it was of a very different quality and was making a much harsher and more right-wing argument about the Greens that I think had more to do with appealing to the views and concerns of their donors than it did to actually having an impact amongst progressive voters who are deciding between Labor and the Greens in terms of who they want to see represent them in the Parliament.
Thank you.
Next question from Samantha Maiden from news.com.
G'day, Paul. During the election campaign, some material from one of your focus groups escaped into the wild, describing Peter Dutton as extreme, creepy, looks better with glasses on, a bit of a wanker, and too Trumpy. I'm wondering if you've kind of buried the lead a bit here. Very diplomatic of you not to mention Donald Trump, but there was a lot of material in those focus groups suggesting voters were worried. How much of a factor was world events and what was going on in the United States with tariffs and Donald Trump?
Thanks very much, Sam. It was a factor, but the number one question for people by far was cost of living. I think there was some polling just after the election that Essential put out that showed that 53% of people nominated cost of living as the number one issue for them. And then it was something down around 12 or 13% of voters who said that their number one question was global uncertainty. So it was very much a big part of the news agenda that people were taking in over the course of the 5 months, and a big part of the debate in the campaign. But the point I wanted to make today was that the much more important and significant factor in determining how people voted was who had the better plan on cost of living and the material risk that Peter Dutton represented.
Thank you.
Next question, Mark Kenny from ANU, and I know you want me to say democracy sausage as well.
Yes, well, that was one of the podcasts the PM did do, and I thank him for that. Peter Dutton was invited, didn't show up. I wonder if I could ask you, Paul, to just give us a bit of information about what your tracking polling was showing in relation to a couple of issues. One of them related to Dutton's constant assertion that the PM was weak. And it seemed to me that this was sort of, particularly as I noticed through the debates when he was quite assertive, that is, Dutton was quite assertive during his debates, yet people, the audiences, kept scoring them fairly decisively for the PM. So I wonder, was this evidence that every time he talked about the PM being weak, it was actually being read by voters as him being too hard? That's the first thing. And also Dutton's reluctance to talk nuclear. Was that did you read that as evidence or suggestion that they were getting tracking polling showing that nuclear wasn't working out there, and did your tracking polling also show that?
Thanks, Mark. I think on that first point, I think there's a lot in your question there, in that insight that the Coalition's attempt and Peter Dutton's attempt to frame leadership questions around strength versus weakness had the effect of reminding people of the harsh and abrasive nature of some of his character and personality. And I completely agree that his very aggressive approach in some of the debates actually turned a lot of people off, and you can see that you could see that on the night in some of the audience reactions in I can't recall which one it was, but in one of the commercial TV station debates.
There were just so many.
Where they had a bit of feedback from the voters afterwards. So I do think there's a lot in that. And then we noticed back in January and February that nuclear energy had dropped out of all of the Liberal Party's paid communication. I think between November of 2024 and election day, they didn't place a single ad that promoted their nuclear energy scheme. And we took that as a sign that they were seeing the same thing that we were seeing, which was that there were a lot of voters out there who had major reservations about their plan, and that the cost of their plan and the fact that the money would have to come from somewhere validated the concerns that we were pointing to about the cuts that Mr Dutton would make.
Thank you.
Just ticking over time, we'll do a final question from Caitlin Rentoul from 7 West Media.
Thank you for your speech today, Paul. There's quite a remarkable story in WA. It's traditionally been a coalition voting state. In 2013, 11 seats went to the Liberal Party. At the 2025 election, 11 seats are now held by Labor. So what is the WA strategy? How was it tailored to cater the state? And do you think that this is a long-term change of voter sentiment in Western Australia?
Thanks, Caitlin. Well, I think the first thing to say about Federal Labor's success at this election in WA is that it didn't happen overnight. The Prime Minister, over the course of his 6 years as leader, has taken the task of engaging with West Australians very, very seriously. He could tell us how many visits he's made. There we go. I've lost some points for not having that fact. And that combined with the quality of our candidates and members over there and the performance of the state Labor government under Premier Cook and before him Premier McGowan means that the Labor brand's never been in stronger shape over in WA. In the campaign itself then, our strategy was really to empower and back in the West Australian branch of the party to lead the campaign effort over there. And that, as it was in 2022, was very successful. And I'm really excited about what Federal Labor and WA Labor now will be able to do in terms of the partnership between Canberra and Perth under the PM and Premier Cook.
Well, thank you very much for your time today. Always great to get these insights. You'll weigh up your own future, so we may or may not see you in 2028. But ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Paul Erickson. Membership for the club somewhere. Thank you.